Welcome to our lecture on Realism, Civil Rights, and Equality is what I'm naming this one. We're going to be covering a selection from Booker T. Washington and from W.E.B. Du Bois. By the way, that's how you pronounce his name. A lot of people say Du Bois, but it's Du Bois. We're going to be sort of bringing up some highlights from the two selections, but we're also going to try to put it into some context. Let me begin with saying that, of course, most people, when they think of literature, they think of fiction or poetry, sometimes drama a little bit, but they don't really think about nonfiction as being a literary genre, but it is. Not all nonfiction is literature. I mean, you know, the label on a cereal box isn't literature, I guess, unless you really try to make it that. But some works are looked at not only for their content and the information, but they're looked at as works of art, even though they're not fiction or poetry or drama. They're nonfiction, and so you can examine nonfiction works like these and ask the question, how are they put together? What is the author's desire? How does it function as a work of art as well as a statement or an argument or an informative piece? We're not going to get into the stylistics of of both of these works, but we are going to talk a little bit about these as works of literature. So let me begin by saying that really following the Civil War, there was a Reconstruction era, as most of you remember from American history, and during that Reconstruction era, 65 through about 1880 or so, you had a lot of upheaval and turmoil, obviously, a lot of things happening but politically in the country, and there were a lot of violence in the South came in response to the political and civil turmoil as so-called radical Republicans in the Congress in Washington, D.C., and also Southern segregationists fought for the future of the South. They knocked heads, if you will, on that sort of thing. Once those Union troops who had occupied the South were withdrawn in 1876, power fell into the hands of local white folks who were living in southern states, many of whom were determined to impose new so-called Jim Crow laws with enforced segregation, disenfranchisement, and discriminatory practices related to hiring, education, basic civil liberties, those kinds of things. And so without going too much into that, just letting you know this is the era we're talking about here, the question that confronted a lot of African American leaders at the time was, which direction should we go as a people, right? And of course, by extension, as a country, all of us, all people, not just black folks, but everybody. So there's this birth of a new generation of African American intellectuals who debated this path forward. And I say that because there's this view that I think is very ill-founded that, you know, African American voices on this subject of civil rights and equality. First of all, there's an idea that it only came about in the 20th century, which is totally wrong. African American writers and thinkers and politicians and artists and everybody had been talking about this issue, the issue of what kind of country do we want and what do we want rights to be and how do we achieve those things, all the way from the get-go, right? But there's also this second thing, this myth of this monolithic movement that there really was only one viewpoint and one voice. Not true at all. There were many, many different viewpoints among African Americans themselves about what that path forward should look like. I'm just pulling out two because we don't have a lot of time to go into all of that. If you took an African American literature class or an African American studies course, you get a lot more than that. But I just want to do this because I want to dispel the myth, and I also want you to get familiar with two of the very most important leading figures of the era. So it deals with the social and political paradox of African Americans themselves. So on the one hand, there's this view that, wow, we have many more possibilities now that slavery has ended of what our future can be, but there are institutional constraints, there are cultural constraints, there are economic constraints that, you know, the big question mark hanging in the air is, okay, so how do we achieve that dream? Because it's a paradox of without resources, without education, without all these different things, how do we get to where we need to be? But then again, to get those resources, we need to almost have to already be there. It's a bit of a catch-22. A lot of the debate seems to have focused on the sub point of education, right? The sub issue of education and which route to take. And you'll see as you read both of these selections and take a look at both of these authors, you'll see a stark difference between them on that issue of education. Let's begin with Booker T. Washington. And what we have here is a selection from the larger work called Up From Slavery, which was a book-length piece. But he pulled out of there the Atlanta Exposition address that he gave in 1895, and that is most of what we have in this selection. Now, Washington was a very highly educated person. He was the head of the Tuskegee Institute, which was a leading historically black college. And the primary points he makes in this Atlanta Exposition address, which was his most famous address, made national news, international news. Most prominent Americans paid very close attention to this address and were very taken with what he had to say. A lot of debate, even among whites, about what the implications of his ideas were. And I think he was taken very seriously among many circles, and not just among African Americans, but also among whites and others, and was considered to be pretty much a heavyweight intellectually in the country with respect to this issue. The first thing he goes through is several different points here that I want to highlight. The first point that he makes really is that black Americans really should first and foremost be educated in the practical trades. Think mechanical things, plumbers, factory workers, welders, those kinds of things, rather than in the arts or philosophy or languages. Now, Du Bois is going to take a very different position on this, but Washington's position is we have to start somewhere, and we have to make ourselves valuable to this new American industrial economy, and the way to do that is to get sort of blue-collar skills, trades. Remember that a lot of people were farm workers. A lot of these former enslaved people were farm workers, and they didn't have technical skills, industrial skills, mechanical skills. And so Washington was saying that's where we need to start. Let's don't start writing philosophy and literature. As a people, we're not there yet. We have to have a generation or two where we're able to provide for our folks, make sure that we're an important, valuable cog or wheel in this big American industrial capital machine. And then once we've become of value, then we advance beyond that. That's a very controversial point that he makes, but it's fundamental to what he says, and I don't want to mischaracterize it. Du Bois will not agree with that. Secondly, economic power, as he puts it, always precedes political power. So the key here is that we have to be valuable workers before people will treat us as valuable citizens. And to be valuable workers, we have to have skills. We can't be unskilled. And so education to Washington means education in the practical arts. Now, you might include in that, for example, engineering, right? And of course, he's always going to believe that African Americans should pursue medicine and law and teaching and different professions. But what he really wants is the vast majority of African Americans to be given an opportunity to gain a sort of a technical skill, a practical technical skill that has economic value, because the economic value will bring political value, he says. Third point, Southern whites should be convinced that, since blacks represent about a third of the South itself, improving the condition of the black race is vital to overall social and economic improvement in the South. And here it's about, we have to convince white Southerners that it's about their improvement as well. Look at the South after the Civil War. It was absolutely devastated. I mean, it had no industry, it had no railroads left, it had nothing left. It was just basically scorched earth. And so what he says is, what we've got to have here is we've got to sell Southern whites on the idea that, look, if we're gonna rise as a region, the South, we're going to have to rise together. We're a third of the population in the South. You hold a third of the population of the South back, and you're holding all the South back in terms of economic advancement, education, the arts, everything. So we've got some work to do, he says, as African Americans, to convince whites that it's in their best interest to help us pursue our best interest. The other point that he makes here is that African Americans really should be political pragmatists. And which means they should pursue politics not ideologically but practically, right? Vote for what gets results, not for some philosophy of politics. And they ought to be willing to make political alliances with whites based on their interests and not vote as a bloc. In other words, Washington's position is, look, we should be voting for whoever benefits us the most. And don't try to vote as a block. Vote instead because we're not going to be a majority, and so it's not going to do us a lot of good to be part of some other larger majority. We need to pursue our own political self-interest and be pragmatic. And if that means striking political bargains with these folks over here who like us, then do it. With these folks over here who don't like us, as long as it benefits us, do it. Right? So he's very agnostic when it comes to political parties. Okay, and says, no, we need to pursue what's in our best interest as a community first. The other thing he says is, and this is kind of an interesting thing, I don't see Du Bois deal with this very much at all, really, and that is that he wants to see black clergy improved in terms of their education and training, and says, look, what we had under slavery was black clergy who largely devoted themselves to the spiritual growth of people, but we don't have the theological training that we need. We need to have a more advanced, more educated black clergy. Remember, this was like 100 and something years ago, guys. Today there are seminaries that people go to and they receive wonderful education. You look at black clergy all over the United States, and they have access to theological centers and get terrific educations and training. But right after slavery, there really wasn't anything for them. And so you had people of goodwill who wanted to proselytize and minister to their communities, but they didn't have sort of the educational background that they needed because it hadn't been afforded to them. He says we got to work on this because our spiritual growth as a community is essential to everything else. If we're going to hold together as a community, it's going to be our commitment to faith that does that for us. Du Bois would reject that because Du Bois basically was an atheist, okay? So he's going to not even really be interested in that at all. So you got really, really opposite guys here you're going to see in the next slide. And then a final point is, which is really problematic, according to a lot of us later on, after 100 years of this, we say, okay. The idea that if we just get Northerners out of the South, Southern whites will want to reform on their own. It is the fact that Northern whites are down in the South telling Southern whites what to do that's making it worse. That if the Northern whites would leave, Southern whites would reform because they don't feel like they're being bullied into doing it. You see my little smirky face there. I'm not so sure about that theory. Most of us looking back said, well, that probably wasn't actually accurate. However, there might have been something to the idea that the resentment of Southern whites towards Northern whites fueled some things that would not have happened otherwise. That we'll let historians deal with that. Okay, we won't argue that. But essentially, the critics to Washington's ideas would say, you're telling us to settle for second-class status and menial jobs. I think that's unfair to Washington in some respects, because it doesn't look at the reasoning behind what he's advocating, and I don't think he ever would have advocated accepting second-class status. What he's trying to do is say, look, how do we make ourselves valuable to the modern American industrial rising power known as the United States of America? Because once we're valuable, they'll need to deal with us. And that will get us political access. It will give us economic leverage, all the things that we need. That the political currency of the United States is called dollars, and we don't earn dollars if we don't have skills. And so we have to start with skills first. That's an approach which you can agree with or disagree with, but it isn't. I think it's simplistic to characterize his statement as being, well, we're settling for second-class citizens and menial jobs. He wasn't looking for that at all. The biggest thing that his writing reveals, in my opinion, is the growing basically clear fact that was emerging that the Civil War hadn't settled the questions of inequality, integration, immigration, opportunity, education, all those issues. All those were completely open questions after the Civil War. There were people who walked away from the Civil War and said, well, we dealt with that, didn't we? No, you just basically opened the door. All the rest of the problems need to be dealt with. And that, as we see today, from our perspective, over 100 years later, is still with us, in very much still with us. The questions of what do you do now? You don't just sort of fire the starting pistol. You have to deal with the question of how do we rebuild community and how do we promote opportunity and all those kinds of things. What Washington's piece really reveals to both blacks and whites is, wow, there's a lot of work to be done here. Yeah, no kidding, Sherlock. There's a whole lot of work to be done here because this has been going on for a long time. You have an entire people who have been enslaved, and now you're telling them that they have to participate in something. And what are we going to do to make sure that participation is fair, that they have opportunity, that they can thrive? Because he is right about this. I think most of us would agree that if 13 or 14% of the country's population is being held back, how in the world do you advance as an entire civilization? We're all being held back if some people are being held back. Doesn't matter. And we're not just talking about African Americans here. We're talking about anybody. But certainly that's being highlighted through this. So here we are heading into a new century in 1895, and this is a text that says, how do we deal with these issues that remain largely undecided? Well, taking a completely different view, I won't say completely different, but a very different view, you have Du Bois. And just Du Bois' text alone strikes us as being more modern in his language, his intellect, his philosophical approach. It's a very philosophical approach, in fact. Even in his use of that metaphor, the vast veil, which is a very famous metaphor. We'll talk about it in just a second, and I'll ask you to comment on it in our discussion. He really presages modernism in many ways. Now, we're not at modernism yet, but we'll get to it next, and you'll see that modernism is the next movement after realism that we want to talk about and spend some time on, but he seems very modern. And, of course, now he's coming after Washington, yes, but he differs from Washington in very critical ways. I just highlighted 4 here, but there are a lot of other ways that he does as well. Du Bois is essentially not big on religion. He is a more sort of radical voice. He believes that Washington is totally incorrect, that African Americans need to aspire to a higher level of learning other than just pragmatic trades, blue-collar jobs. We have to be taken seriously as a people. We have to produce our own philosophy, our own art, our own culture, our own music, our own literature, because we will never be seen. Because if you say no, we're gonna become practical tradespeople, then white society or the dominant society will never see us as equal. They'll always see us as workers. They won't see us as equal, and he wants to be seen as equal. That's a very compelling argument in many respects. So is Washington's, right? They're both really great arguments. I'm not going to pick a side here, and you don't have to either. It's just that Du Bois is basically saying, well, no, if we have a generation or two where everybody thinks all African Americans are plumbers or, electricians, that's all well and good, and that's respectable, yes, but we'll soon gain a reputation as being a people that doesn't create art, that doesn't have philosophy, that does not promote higher education, that doesn't have philosophy, and then we'll be thought of as inferior, and we don't want to be seen that way. So that's a really compelling argument, I think. It's really interesting that he makes that case, because I think there's something to that. The second point of difference here is that, look, there's a joint responsibility for African American improvement. I think Washington doesn't necessarily disagree with that, but he does seem to place more of the burden or onus on African Americans to improve themselves. You can see from some of the points in the previous slide that, look, he thinks having engagement from whites is extremely important, but Du Bois goes even further than that and says, no, they have a responsibility to help African Americans improve. It's not just that we need to convince these folks. They have a moral obligation to help as well. And so there's a lot more emphasis on that. He also believes that Booker T. Washington's emphasis is really on materialism over culture, that he's too preoccupied with money and with financial well-being and economic well-being, and not enough over cultivating African American culture. This is a thing that Du Bois points out that I think is super important, and I do think Washington misses this, and that is Du Bois puts his finger on a key issue or problem facing the African American community, and that is, we don't have a definition of who we are. We don't have a common culture. That's been taken from us, and we have to rebuild a cultural identity. If you look at other people that immigrated to this country, and they had a hard time too, right? I'm not taking anything away from that. Look at Irish immigrants that were treated like dirt in this country. I mean, just treated like trash. Jewish immigrants that were facing anti-Semitism. Eastern Europeans, Italians faced terrible discrimination. Lots of people did. Lots of people did. But the one thing that they had was a unifying sense of common culture. I mean, you still see it with Italian Americans today. I've got some cousins who are Italian. They're wonderful people. And gosh, you walk into an Italian household and there's a sense of tradition and of belonging and shared experience. And Du Bois points out, look, that was taken from us because, number one, most of our ancestors came from many different nationalities in Africa, were brought over, taken away, their religion, their traditions, their language were all taken away and substituted with what? An incredibly limited cultural experience of their own, right? And so we have to develop our own culture. And how do we do that? And his criticism against Washington is your approach ignores the need for us to have a common culture and a common shared experience. That's a really compelling argument, I think. And then the other thing that he argues is, look, once we give rights away, it's really hard to get them back. It's really hard to get them back. So post-Civil War, there were black people who held office in the different southern states and in Congress. And if you tell us to ratchet down the political, even a smidge, it's going to be really hard to get it back. That's why I put that quotation down there at the bottom. The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression, which is a great line. You should think about that. We should all think about that. That's true no matter who you are or what country you're in or what color you are. The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. It is less costly to fight for freedom than it is to put up with being repressed. And that, think about that. That's really a compelling point. So generally he's fair and respectful to Booker T. Washington. I don't think there's any lack of respect there, but there's no doubt that he differs from him on this. And both have great points. He's a younger voice. He's a more radical voice in his piece. Less patient, less willing to, put up with gradualism, if you will. Not surprisingly, Du Bois was seen by a lot of whites as being not terribly constructive in their view, right? Whereas the white establishment tended to think Washington was a better representative of the African American community. There's a tendency throughout American history for the dominant culture, be it white or whatever, to look for the black voice, meaning one guy. And I think that's been just a terrible mistake historically that we keep making over and over and over again, that there are voices, plural, and differences of opinion in the African American community, just like there's in every community, for heaven's sakes. And that they all deserve to be listened to, and they all deserve a seat at the table, and they all ought to be considered. Because we can learn from all of those. Because, look, these are not simple problems. So they're not going to have straightforward, simple, do this, and this solutions. And there's going to be a difference in view. I got to tell you, every time I read one or the other, I think, that both of these guys have terrific points to make. Both of them should be heard. I don't know what the approach should be. But I know that they both make a great case. Certainly the establishment, the political establishment, which was of course heavily segregationist, thought Washington was superior in his approach and views to Du Bois. That fueled Du Bois and others like him to say, well, if the white establishment likes Washington, you can bet that's not the way to go, and so on and so forth. My point is just to raise these voices now to show that there's contrast, there's diversity within the African American community. We didn't have time to do 6 or 12 or 15 different writers, but these two will at least illustrate that exists. And to realize that this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time. It's still with us today, right? Very timely today, about these questions of what does it mean to be equal? What does it mean to have opportunity? What are the rights that everybody should have, right? These are still continuing conversations even today. And I want you to focus also on the veil metaphor, because he spends some time, Du Bois does, on that metaphor of the veil, that there's a veil, there's something between me and other people, especially whites, that exists there. And it's like a wedding veil, right? Only not that positive. That there's a veil there, something that separates me. I want you to explore that. That's what I'm going to ask you to do in the discussion session. Now, our quiz, you had to read everything in the text. Our quiz questions. 1, what famous organization did W.E.B. Du Bois help create? All right, that will be in your text. 2, which president invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner? Right? That should be in the text as well. I believe it is. If it's not, my golly, you can do a little research and go find that out, for heaven's sakes. But that's very interesting because a statue of that president has been removed now from the American National History Museum in New York City. Just this past week, the decision was made to remove that president's statue, and the ruckus is, wait a minute, that president was the first one to invite an African American of any stature to the White House for dinner, and he caught a lot of resistance to it and stuck to his guns on it. So the controversy is, wait a minute, why are you removing that statue? He actually opened doors and such. So do a little research on that if it's not in the text. I thought it was in the text. I don't know if it is or not, but you can go, you know what Google is, right? And so make sure that everything is turned in and done and posted by Thursday at midnight if you would. Thanks.